Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Today we have with us Professor Aijaz Ahmad and we will discuss the developments in Ukraine. We have done this earlier, but obviously certain events have taken place. There is almost a civil war situation in the east and south of Ukraine, and we now have Poroshenko, who has been elected the president of this rump government in Kiev. Aijaz, it does appear that after Poroshenko's election, things have worsened in the south and east of Ukraine, and the attacks seem to have increased.
Very much so. In fact, this has been a great surprise for very many people because Poroshenko was supposedly pro-Soviet, pro-Russian, or at least neutral between the two, and partly because he has had industrial interests and as well as markets in Russia and so on. Which, by the way, the Russians have taken over some time ago. And the speculation was that becoming the president, he would negotiate with Russia in such a way that being an oligarch, his primary interest would be in protecting his own interests. But it seems to me that what he has done is, having captured captured power, he has thrown all his chips in the basket of the United States. It seems to be. So as soon as he got elected, he ordered a much broader escalation in terms of the military attacks in eastern Ukraine, yes. And he owns a television station which has been leading the propaganda campaign against what he calls the terrorists.
This is the other interesting part, that those who have been protesting basically started as arguing for self-determination, that also for a limited purpose, autonomy. They were not really talking about separating from Ukraine. They were really talking at that point of time for more autonomy, regional autonomy, a federated state of Ukraine and so on. Now this has become a demand for independence, in fact separation. This seems to have happened after this attack started, not only with Poroshenko, but also what we saw in Odessa.
I think probably the Odessa killings were the decisive ones. I think you're right. I see these eastern provinces as having, of course, sympathies with the Russians and so on, but not necessarily ultra-Russian nationalists of any kind in their own cultural makeup. I think they felt very vulnerable by the idea of EU coming in and taking over Ukrainian economy, which would actually mean the destruction of Ukraine's own industry. And one of the ways Russia has been subsidizing Ukraine, everyone talks about the subsidy through gas, gas subsidies and so on. But one of the massive ways Russians have been subsidizing Ukraine is to buy industrial products, including military hardware, from these industries to keep them alive. Russia has actually been upgrading its own industrial base for the same kind of products, and it could very easily not buy them.
They have, in fact, twin sources for all the military products, so they don't need Ukraine essentially for military products.
They could actually replace it with all that. It has been their way of subsidizing. So these people in the East partly have sympathy towards Russia because that's where the money comes from. That's where they make these things and they sell them to Russia. So it was fear of EU, the opposition to that, this whole thing about the EU and IMF and so on. Opposition has come very largely from the East for that reason. So there was that kind of thing. Then these people, these fascists came to power and started banning the Russian language and so on, and all of that made them very nervous.
Also Russian TV stations being taken off.
And so on. Then came the Crimean vote and integration back into Russia and so on, and that created some sort of a stir there. But I think the decisive moment was the unleashing of that violence. Because by the time Odessa happened, two things had happened. One is that some 400 to 600 soldiers are American soldiers are known to be operating all over the East. That number has been verified by the German intelligence services, the number may be higher.
It could also be black water.
Who knows? Blackwater has been serving that kind of function in Iraq on a massive scale, where a part of the American forces are camouflaged as contractors, and so on. That and the right sector, as National Guards or whatever, but also through their own independent militia, they spread all over the place. And that came to a head after Odessa. And after Odessa, there has been a move to say, that federalization project really got going, that we are going to have autonomy and maximum autonomy and so on. And then came these escalations, the ones that we were talking about earlier. So it is actually in response to this immense violence that now there is a mood to ask for independence, and they're actually saying two new legal entities have now come into being, and you have to deal with it, whether you want to talk about any kind of unified state or separate ones.
Donetsk and the Luhansk regions, these two have come together. It's also interesting if you look at the linguistic map of Ukraine, you will find that about 75% of the people in these two regions actually have mother tongue or basically speak Russian, which of course a large part of Ukraine does, even if they are not ethnically, they don't think they're Russians.
Right.
But this is really those who are ethnic and linguistically Russian. Yeah. And then as you go down even up to, for instance, Odessa, the numbers actually decrease. So these are the two really centers of Russian language and ethnicity in Ukraine.
It's a very mixed picture. There are in eastern Ukraine, there are people of Polish origin, Hungarian origin, various kinds of origins of that kind, for whom Russian is the first language.
Even for Julia Tymoshenko, who doesn't speak in public Russian, but that's her first language as well.
That is the other part. Ultimately, Russian is also the language of culture and knowledge and this, that, and the other. So people may speak Ukrainian at home and call themselves Ukrainian speaking and so on, and they may even be Ukrainian nationalists and so on, but their language of culture and sophistication and entertainment and so on is Russian. So that this is a very, fact of the matter is that the whole of the Ukraine was a part of Russia. And it's with the collapse of the Soviet Union that this was quite artificially separated out from Russia to make Russia as small and as weak as possible.
Two things that are, I think, important that we need to think about, in the Ukrainian scenario, that you now have a situation where the NATO wanted to take over Ukraine. One of the things which was really the center of the controversy was Ukraine joining NATO, like Georgia earlier wanted to join NATO, and in that, of course, loss of Crimea and Sevastopol, which Russia would not could not accept, because that's their access to the Mediterranean Sea. Black Sea is only warm water port they have, so there's no way they were going to give it up. But geopolitically, NATO's expansion, that is one issue we have discussed earlier, which is, I think, one of the threats that Russia faces. And the second one, that Ukraine is not a small country, it's about 40 plus million people. And this economy is difficult for anybody to subsidize. So European Union, if it wants to take over Ukraine, which is what it seems to be the project, or that's a US project which will be funded by Europeans, it's a huge bill that they're looking at. Do you think this is really physically possible for them to do that?
Prabir, I believe that it's perfectly possible for them to throw in $300 billion or $500 billion or whatever it takes. There's access capital in Europe. But EU and Bundesbank and all of them are not in the business of building up countries. They're in the business of turning Ukrainian workers into cheapest possible labor and Ukrainian women into prostitutes. That's what they're really into. So whether they have the capacity, yes, they do. Whether they have any such intention, no, they don't. And that is what people in the East saw very, very clearly. And as time passes and as this austerity begins to really bite,
IMF austerity program.
IMF austerity program begins to bite, which is the price of whatever little funding they are going to give, this is going to become clearer to people, a lot of people in Western Ukraine also. So you're going to have a great mess. On the other hand, these oligarchs and this upper layer of Ukrainian society, all they want to do is to get all that money from EU or wherever it comes from, World Bank or whatever, put it in their pockets, and when it becomes too hot, just run and go and live in.
A lot of them already do. For instance, Kolobowski, one of the architects of the Odessa massacre, is an oligarch who stays in Switzerland. So he's the governor of one of the oblasts in southeast Ukraine.
Some of the oligarchs live in London, some of them live in Germany, some of them have dual nationality.
The other interesting issue that comes up is that Russia with Putin has had some control over the oligarchs over the last 10 years. It's not that he's ended the reign of the on the economy of the oligarchs, but he's controlled them, and state has regained some of its preeminence.
That is what is resented about Putin by everybody, including the West, who are working with those oligarchs that he has put under the control of the Russian state.
This is not true for Ukraine. Ukraine still continues total loot, whether it's Yankovic or the current.
It's quite the opposite. It may well be that one of the reasons for whatever sanctions that they have imposed is, the Americans have imposed, is that it's not going to hurt the Russian economy, but it may hurt particular oligarchs. And they then can be recruited into the bid to replace Putin or whatever, get rid of him in one way or another. Some measures can be more extreme than others.
The other and the last important question, I think, that fact that this kind of pressure is coming on Russia, there is also on China's side an equal desire to have some reapproachment with Russia, which they have been building up for some time, because of the kind of events taking place in South China Sea and the US role over there. Pivot to Asia, as Hillary Clinton said and Obama has repeated. Do you think Russia and China coming together, signing a gas deal, talking about how they can come together, this is a new development, this is an important development, because the Americans have sea power, obviously. They have power over outer space, over internet, but Russia and China coming together is really a huge land power, and Iran is not too far from that.
It's a major shift in structures of global power. The way I would put it is that, when the Americans invaded Iraq, I remember writing an article for Frontline in which I talked about imperial overreach. Now, having done what they have done in the Middle East and having made a complete mess of it, geopolitical mess of it, having done what they have done in Libya and so on, I think they have, instead of stepping back, they have now escalated to a level which is completely beyond their control. So you really have an imperial power which is desperate to hold on to its primacy in the world in whatever way possible, and seeing that China and Russia separately are both challenges to them, and taking actions which force them virtually to not only just come together but integrate. I mean, the Chinese are saying that the development of Western China and Asian Russia is a single project which we are going to pursue together. Now, this is something historically unprecedented.
This kind of closeness never existed before.
It could, except for American belligerence of this order, in which they are building immense military power around China and around Russia, and they think they can just, encircle them and somehow smash them, and they have some sort of a fantasy. This is forcing them. The country that has the greatest resource of energy in the world, and the country which has the greatest resource of productive power and access capital.
And hunger for energy.
Sure, absolute hunger for energy. Bringing the two of them together, where it's an extraordinary event, and Meanwhile, in Ukraine, they have no clue what is going to happen, because I believe that one of the things that is going to happen is that in Western Ukraine, there is going to be a conflict between the real fascists, who are very much in power, and they're not going to give up their power without fight. They're armed. And these other jokers who have little militias of their own, each one of those oligarchs have. So I actually believe that down the line, there's going to be conflict inside Western Ukraine.
Clash of these
Yeah.
two sets.
Yes. So they will mess up Ukraine as they have messed up Syria, as they have messed up other countries, just destroy countries as sort of experiment.
Aijaz, we'll probably come back to this topic one day, but not today, which is that America has enormous military power today, the ability to smash other countries, but their ability to retain other countries and hold them economically or politically, this seems to be weakening. So you have we have this peculiar mix of situation which makes life for all of us around the world much worse, in fact.
The world is going to suffer a lot as this, uncontrollable military power, which is hollow from inside and getting hollower and hollower by the day as it goes around destroying various parts of the world in order to hold on to their dominance.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to this topic because I think Ukraine now needs to be watched in the future. Important developments, rise of officially of fascism, politically, taking political power in a country which is not a small one, and then the geopolitical significance of this Russia, China coming together, what the NATO and European Union wants to do. All this we will need to...
Also, I remember the last time we were discussing Ukraine was before the European elections, and I remember us saying that this coming to power of fascism in a major European country is going to embolden such forces in the rest of the continent. And the elections have shown that.
Thank you, Aijaz. I think that's an important issue that we also need to perhaps address, what's happening to the larger EU project and the rise of fascism in European Union itself. Thanks. We'll come back to these topics again when we meet next time.